Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Jamie, and I'm joined by the podcasting power couple themselves, our very own JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, Erin and Matt.
Oh, no.
I knew you'd like that.
Uh-oh.
Matt, I'm not getting into a plane with you. You know I already hate flying.
I didn't know that was coming. That's fine. I don't intend to fly a small plane anytime
Matt, I love you. I'm not sure anybody's on the level of JFK Jr., at least in terms of looks. Oh, I don't want to be mean. I'm just saying that.
I don't think I could compete with JFK Jr. either.
I don't think anybody can compete with him.
I'm sorry. I started. I didn't know what Pandora's box out over there.
I didn't know the podcast was going to have these kinds of
Well,
stakes,
Matt, this is where you could say, and you woman are no Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, because that is true as well.
I could say that,
No.
but I'm not going to say that.
Matt's smarter than that.
Not me. I said it. It's on the pod.
I didn't say it. Okay, before I start, and before there becomes more of a rate how much Erin and Matt compare to JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy,
please don't. We won't rank very high.
I wanted to shout out Diane K for her wonderful review of the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Thank you, Diane. She's been such an amazing fan, big commenter since our early days. I don't know if you can say that when her podcast's been only a year old, but
no.
Early days, you know.
We really appreciate you, Diane. All the comments, everything. It's nice to know that they're more than just our mom listening.
So be like Diane and leave us a rating or review, or better yet, you can join us on Patreon for extra content each month. For those interested, this month, I know for sure I'm putting up a poll because I have no idea who I want to do next for my offender. So you guys can help me out to choose. I know I want to do also a mini episode on the challenges Haiti has faced since becoming a free nation, which is going to be maybe covered today, but most likely in our part 2. I'm having a feeling it's going to be a part 2 one. And I know Erin and I have talked, speaking of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, one of our earlier episodes, we've been talking back and forth about wanting to do a mini episode, mini update, since a lot of people are talking about American Love Story, Ryan Murphy's show that's currently in production. And there's a lot of feelings, a lot of commentary on that.
Yeah, and there's a new CNN original series about JFK Jr. himself, who, I don't know, we might cover on this podcast unto himself, get him a separate episode, but there's that series as well on CNN, American Prince, I believe.
Oh, great. Yeah, I didn't even know that there was that.
Yeah, I think it's a 2 or 3 part series. I think 2 parts are out. I think there might be 3.
Very nice. I know a lot of people have been looking for information because I know, Erin, you covered, what was the book that you used? I know it's been a hot topic, or one that people have been reading in advance of American Love Story. It seems like Carolyn Bessette Kennedy in particular.
Yeah, it's Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. That was the one I used for the pod. That one's highly recommended. I know that you can see the uptick in numbers as people have been seeing some of the pictures of the miniseries that's getting filmed.
Right. A lot of opinions about casting, about a whole lot of things. I'm not going to make any exclamations yet. We'll talk about, I definitely want to hear, Erin, your viewpoint, especially as somebody who did the research for that pod. So those are the things that you'll see coming out on Patreon here soon. You can join us there. We've got 2 tiers. And if you want to join as a free member, we also release occasionally some free content as well. So we'd love to see you there. Today, I'm going to first set a disclaimer that there are a ton of French names in this one. I am not a native French speaker, and while I did take French in high school, I'm going to apologize to Madame Johnson, my teacher, our French teacher. It's been a while. I'm doing my best. I haven't taken French since college, and I had a little bit of a scarring experience, not with Madame Johnson, but with a French professor who would snap and point at you.
We won't do that.
Still getting through some trauma there, so I'm going to work through the best I can today. But I'm happy to have both of you here today to talk about Toussaint Louverture. He's definitely a departure from really the last figures I've done. I've done a lot of women lately. So being a man, and we have a Haitian, won't be Haiti at this point, but somebody from outside the European area, or I've been doing, it seems like, more modern American figures as well, and a revolutionary. So a little different for me, but it was fun to do for sure. I told Erin, since this is the post-pants era, I definitely want to hear Matt's commentary on.
Yeah, I should be able to. I know a little bit about this story.
Yeah, Matt, this is kind of in your realm. Maybe not the Americas, but obviously Haiti and the Caribbean are deeply tied to American history.
Right. And as I'm sure Jamie will point out as we move forward, the United States and Haiti have a tortured history that doesn't usually reflect well on the United States.
Yeah, I'm very curious to hear a few of the comparisons. While he's not a new topic for me overall, I did teach a little bit on the Haitian Revolution when I taught world history, but it was definitely much abbreviated. I wanted to start as a one-parter, but as most of our podcasts go, those are notorious words here. And so most likely it's going to be a two-parter. So I'm going to just say that from the front. I've come to terms that it most likely will be a two-parter here. I will refer to him mostly as Toussaint because that's easier for me to say. It's not that we're on first name basis. It's just for me, out of respect for the French-speaking people, that's how I'm going to do it. If we wanted to really say the story in a quick one-liner, I could say, again, who we're covering, Toussaint Louverture. He's a man who led a slave revolt in the Caribbean that reshaped history. In fact, the largest successful slave revolt in history. Some historians, I'll talk about a specific historian in particular where I got a lot of my information, calling it the greatest revolution in modern times. It sparks abolitionist movements worldwide, and he's definitely deserving of being up there with other revolutionaries that we talk about who rise from nothing to become one of the top leaders at the time. And of course, there's some controversy along the way.
He wouldn't be on the pod if not.
Right. I know. I said that could be our shortest episode yet. I could leave it there, but that one sentence bio is pretty spot on for our show.
Yeah, I really don't know too much about him, so I'm excited to hear more. I think really the only thing I know is obviously the Haitian Revolution, just that he's involved in it. I don't know the ins and outs, but also I believe he's referred as the Black Spartacus.
Yes, I'm going to mention that.
Yeah, that'll tie into that slave revolt, Spartacus being, for those I'm sure most people know, but a gladiator who led a slave revolt in the Roman Republic, late Roman Republic.
You're stealing my lines there, and I was going to mention. No, the historian I'm going to be talking about actually wrote a book called Black Spartacus. So
I got to go with whatever I know. I know Rome. I'm just taking what I know, so that this might be the most that I can offer in terms of knowledge.
Some also compare him to Napoleon, which is ironic as we get there. I'm going to do my best to keep it chronological. Normally, I'll jump all over, but I'm going to try to keep it chronological and try to provide the best historical context that I can. Obviously, he's not just this man isolated in his bubble. The world he lives in that time period is so full of things that you need to kind of know to get some of those intricacies. So I'm going to do some little side stories, but try not to get too bogged up in that. But definitely making some comparisons to some of things that we've talked in the past, other European revolutions, and of course, for our American listeners, things that we're more familiar, especially if we're talking about heading to the Caribbean. I really, want to be like dropped in the middle of this forgotten spot in the Caribbean.
She's doing her Hamilton.
Sorry, it's right time period, but wrong man and island. So not Hamilton, but we are in the Caribbean, the same general time period of coming from nowhere. For those who know me, big Hamilton fan. Could definitely be some overlap, you could say, between their stories of coming from nothing to rising high in the ranks and then also
a fall,
having untimely ends.
That's good. You left some mystery there. So now we're going to wonder how the connections will unfold.
We're going to Haiti. Well, it's Saint-Domingue.
Is it Saint-Domingue?
That's the other side of the island.
Oh, okay.
Santo Domingo. But we're going to Saint-Domingue or Saint-Domingue. I've heard it pronounced both. Little geography lesson for people who are maybe not as up to on geography. We're on one island in the Caribbean. Half of it today is Haiti. The other half is the Dominican Republic. At this time, the island itself is called Hispaniola, and it includes Saint-Domingue, which is about 1/3. It's the western half of the island. That will again later become Haiti. And then the other part, which is Santo Domingo, which at the time is controlled by the Spanish. So you have one island, two colonized areas, and later free countries. And that also, for anybody who is more familiar with modern history and their own cultural differences, it is really interesting to see on specifically a little piece of land. You know, we're not talking large, but you have these cultural differences because of the colonization past and what makes each country kind of unique to its part of the island. We're focusing on what will become Haiti, not Haiti right now, though. This is what will lead to Haiti. Toussaint Louverture, he was born into slavery on the island of Saint-Domingue, which I said what will be modern-day Haiti. We don't know his exact date of birth. Unsurprisingly, being born into slavery, we don't have a lot of documentation. Anywhere between 1740 and 1743 is what I've seen. The National Museum of African American History and Culture puts it closer to 1743. Some of the other sources, for example, the author of Black Spartacus puts it closer to 1740, but somewhere in that area, within a few years. Saint-Domingue at the time was a French colony and what was pretty much the crown jewel of France's Atlantic Empire in the 18th century. It was nicknamed the Pearl of the Antilles. It was rich from cash crops. If you're making a comparison to the United States at the time, talking about slavery, in the United States, in the southern United States, we have cotton is that huge cash crop that's running the economy. In Saint-Domingue, it's going to be sugar and coffee, especially sugar cane.
Yeah. The one thing I know and that I can contribute again, out of my area, it's not medieval. It's not medieval England or medieval France. So a little outside my depth, but I know that Caribbean slavery was a whole different kind of brutal. Not to downplay the horrors of a cotton plantation in the American South, but slavery and the sugar plantations and elsewhere took it to a whole different level.
Yes.
I'm sure, Matt, you can regale us with stories of the horrors of Caribbean slavery.
Yeah, and that's actually what I'm going to bring up next. And then I do have a question for Matt. So yeah, that's actually a perfect little transition. Saint-Domingue is a major part of the Atlantic slave trade. Just to kind of put things in context with numbers, before the 1791 revolution, about 750,000 captive Africans were brought there. In fact, by 1789, there were 500,000 enslaved people on Saint-Domingue versus 30,000 white settlers. So you have a huge number discrepancy. Mm-hmm. And just like Erin said, not that being a slave anywhere in the Americas was positive. It's so hard when you're talking about those things.
Again, not trying to downplay it at all.
Because it's going to be the same with Toussaint's life, where he had a quote-unquote better plantation owner. You're still talking about slavery. So, yeah, not that anything was positive, but Saint-Domingue was notoriously one of the harshest places due to the high mortality rates from both being overworked, disease, brutal conditions. From a 2010 article on Haiti's past and present, and another lecture I heard on the historian, who I'm going to bring up here shortly, they note that the average life expectancy of an enslaved person in Saint-Domingue was about 21. Obviously, very, very rough conditions, and a little bit also different than slavery in the South. Most were born in Africa and brought over, although Toussaint's going to be an exception, as opposed to what we're used to closer to the Civil War, where they're born into slavery in that place, having been brought over. So still having memories of life in Africa, which is going to come into play when we get to the revolution as well. There's horrifying violence against enslaved individuals. So trigger warning there. We are going to be talking about some violence, quite a bit in this, both towards enslaved individuals and then slave owners. Any type of pushback led to high levels of mutilation, torture, murder of enslaved peoples because they had a very strict social hierarchy in place. So if you're thinking of it like a pyramid, when we talk about hierarchies, obviously we have enslaved Africans at the bottom. We have free white French colonists at the top. We have some people in the middle. There are some free Black settlers, which we'll talk about, or free Black slaves, but it's a very strict social hierarchy. And you can tell why there's going to be such a big pushback against any revolt, especially when you think about those numbers. We're talking about 500,000 enslaved people.
Yeah.
500,000 enslaved people versus 30,000 white settlers. The idea of a slave revolt is going to be pretty terrifying for the
minority
slave owners there.
It's the same thing with Roman slavery, if you go back, because the number is so skewed to the slaves that you have to have that brutality, that crackdown in order to keep that going. That's just, unfortunately, the only way. But then that also creates more resentment, more hatred. It's just this slippery cycle, and that's true in the Roman slavery perspective, true here in the Caribbean, obviously true in the American South to an extent as well.
Yeah, Matt, do you want to speak on that? Especially after what's going to happen here, but still at the time, there's that huge fear of a slave revolt. And so all the things that were put in place by slave owners to prevent it as much as possible.
It's a really disturbing corner of the American experience to explore. But, just as we have criminal law, tax law, family law, there was an entire corpus of law, the slave codes, that were always strengthened after rebellions. So there's a whole series of colonial rebellions. Probably the most famous is the Stono Rebellion, which happens right about the time that Louverture was born. There's another one in 1801. That's Gabriel's Rebellion. There's a famous one in the 1820s. That's the Denmark-Vesey plot in South Carolina. I think most listeners will be somewhat familiar with Nat Turner's.
That's the only one I recognize.
Yeah, that's the one I'm most familiar with as well.
In each and every case, the reason that the uprising stirs such fear is because while there are certain geographic swaths of the South that are kind of on a trajectory away from enslaved labor, there are other parts of the South, especially South Carolina, that are just deeply invested in it. So by way of example, I pulled up the 1860 census. This is the last census prior to the onset of the Civil War. And it really shows you how broadly construed a term like the South is in the American experience. You can say you identify as a Southerner and, you could be from Lubbock, Texas, or you could be from Baltimore, Maryland, technically.
Right. Very different experiences.
The culture is going to show some real variability there. But Delaware had 1,798 enslaved persons in 1860. So that's about 1.6% of its population. Whereas in South Carolina, it's 402,000, which is almost 60% of its population.
Wow.
So the farther south you go, the more anxiety you have that a rebellion here might actually succeed. That actually factors in later on, kind of ties back to some earlier podcasts we've done. Because the white South is so animated by this fear, expansion westward doesn't just become economically desirable as they transition from tobacco to cotton production. It kind of becomes perceived as like the only path that will allow them to endure as a people, because if they don't keep expanding into new territory, eventually the enslaved labor force will outnumber.
That's just math. That's going to happen.
And there were even some white progressives in the North who talked about this thing called the scorpion sting, that if you surround a scorpion with fire, eventually it stings itself and it dies of its own venom. And the idea was if you limit slavery to this southeastern corridor in the United States, eventually it will perish from within. And Haiti was one of the places that was pointed to as an example of this kind of inevitable outcome.
Yeah, that's a great way, I think, to draw some comparisons. You're definitely going to see what happens in Saint-Domingue, which will become Haiti. That's going to obviously bring broader fears to the Americas when they see what happens there, because it definitely, I'll talk about a spark for the Haitian Revolution, but it's really a explosion. It's not slow burning like a trickle.
Something happens.
And intense violence right from the beginning. Back to Toussaint, what we do know, and right at the start, I do want to say disclaimer. I looked at, as I said, different books like Black Spartacus, as well as a lecture by the author, who I'll talk about here more in a minute. I looked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I looked at a few other videos, like on biographics and History Today. Pretty much everyone says this is kind of what we know, but there's a lot of ambiguity because he was not born, obviously, as somebody who people thought, oh, this is going to be a leader. We're going to have all these records.
Why would they be writing anything down about somebody like him at this point? But it's like the women in history. What? Nobody's looking at the women. Nobody's looking at the slaves.
Right. And he doesn't come into what we would say power or prominence until he's 50.
Wow. That's a long time.
So for him, he has and nobody else has any knowledge that he's not going to just spend his days living there and, dying. I don't want to say in obscurity, but just as another, we'll see. In that case, he's going to be free at that point, but as just a free farmer.
And we should point out, too, and I'm sure you'll get to this, it's not entirely understood how he comes to be free. That's still kind of a mystery. And then I always have to warn my students sometimes with names. This is a name he gives himself.
So he's not going to be born, definitely, Toussaint Louverture. That's going to come later. What we do know, he's born on a plantation somewhere in the northern coast of present-day Haiti. So his last name at birth is Breda, which is the name of the plantation. Louverture will be a name adopted later. Whether it's by himself or by another general, it's going to be based on his skills. And we'll talk about what that French word means if you're not familiar with French. But a lot of his early life is spotty at best and comes with a lot of conflicting information. For example, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, they gave much more information on his parentage versus other sources that were much more vague. But I'll first tell you what the National Museum of African American History and Culture talked about, and at least some common themes of what we do know. So they go as far as naming his father as Go Gnu, who is the son of a king in West Africa, and his mother was Gnu's second wife. Other sources are less certain about whether that was his father or his grandfather. There seems to be some source of agreement that he most likely had West African lineage. While he was born in Saint-Domingue, his parents came from West Africa.
He's first generation Haitian.
Yeah, which is, as I said, I don't want to say rare, but more on the rare side. Because the mortality rate was so high, a lot of the enslaved people were coming straight from Africa, but he is a first generation. And as we talked about that idea of, quote unquote, being lucky with a huge asterisk, we could say he's as lucky as an enslaved person could be because he did gain favor with his plantation owner. We don't know too much about his education. Most likely it was self-taught. I'll talk a little bit about where he could have learned that. But we do know that he was allowed to learn French. And he did have some positive relationship to the plantation owner, which I'll come back to later. I guess we can say we have evidence of that. I'll just hint at that.
Okay.
He was able to, quote unquote, move up the ladder, so to speak. We do know when it comes to slavery, there's also a hierarchy of those who work, in this case, in the sugar and coffee plantations and those who are working more domestic work. He was able to become a livestock handler, a healer, a coachman, and a steward.
Oh, wow. He's not in the worst of it.
No.
Working the plantation and a sugar plantation. if you're out there doing the actual work there. I mean, you're a body, you're going to die, and then they're going to ship in more people and replace you. So again, asterisks.
Right.
It's better than what you could be, but still not great.
Right. So I don't want to make it sound like he had it easy, but as we said, we know there's a hierarchy with slavery too, and domestic slaves were more at the top, the work that he was doing. It seems like his intelligence and his calm demeanor earned him respect among both the enslaved people and the overseers. But he is seeing the harsh conditions because he's still on a plantation, so he's not unaware of it.
You can't hide that, and they wouldn't even think to hide it because they don't think that it's bad.
No, another anomaly for him. Unlike, of course, many fellow enslaved people on Saint-Domingue, he was literate. We don't know quite how he got his education. Again, nothing's written down about that. Most likely, again, was informal. It's not like he was sent to school as an enslaved person. So some people say perhaps free people of color helped educate him. Others say educated other enslaved persons, and others say religious education. Notably, he is Roman Catholic. For those who are familiar with France, especially at this time, very Catholic. He's very Catholic. And so some of people think some of that religious education helped build his education. And what we do know from his letters demonstrated that he definitely had knowledge of both French and Creole and a mix of other African languages. And he definitely had a familiarity with Greek, Italian, and French philosophers, what we would call, again, those Enlightenment. Particularly Rousseau is one that I saw pop up.
We know the French revolutionaries loved them some Rousseau.
Yes, so these are going to be the same Enlightenment sources that we know are going to inspire other revolutionaries, as well as other revolutionary documents, such as constitutions, including what will be Haiti's first constitution. If you're not familiar with the Enlightenment, I'm not going to go too much in detail, but those idea of these really broad, big ideas. Matt, I don't know if you want to do a brief of kind of how I think most people will be more familiar with how the Enlightenment affected early U.S. history.
Yeah, I guess the way that we should probably approach it is to sort of touch on the paradox that it's going to create for people living in bondage, because the core principle that's going to connect a lot of Enlightenment thinkers is the idea of natural rights and a state of nature and a social contract. And those are some of the tensions that will ultimately lead to the French Revolution. But what's happening in the United States during this period, which is still in its infancy, right? And in fact, when he's born, there still is no United States. We're about 30 years away from the revolution. But the argument goes that in a pre-Enlightenment context, nobody needs to justify what we might later call slavery, because everybody exists in somebody else's orbit. Every priest has a bishop, every bishop has an archbishop, every archbishop has a cardinal, the cardinals report to the pope, children are considered the property of their parents, wives are considered the property of their husbands, every lord has to report to an earl, to a duke, to a baron, everybody fits somewhere in the system. It's only when you get into like a colonial and post-colonial context where the people who come across the Atlantic by choice typically don't have title, typically don't have status, typically don't possess inherited privilege. And then the people who are brought across the Atlantic in chains are having to completely reinvent their identity if they survive. So fast forward through the American Revolution and eventually the French counterpart, and it's only after you have a so-called free society that now you have to somehow square that with Enlightenment principles, right? If this is supposedly a post-Enlightenment culture,
right,
where we believe in natural rights and social contract, how do we justify holding people in chains?
It's difficult.
And that's when you begin to see arguments about racial identity or biological explanations. All of that comes later.
Yeah.
So that's sort of weird, because it means that the Enlightenment, for all of its promise and potential to liberate people, it actually becomes kind of a midwife. It becomes kind of a passage in time and space to justify these racial hierarchies that didn't necessarily exist before.
For sure. I mean, especially when we get here shortly to the French Revolution, which I'll talk about. It's like, yes,
we freed ourselves from monarchy, but...
Right. Oh, asterisks. doesn't apply to you in the empire, especially those who are enslaved. There's a lot of asterisks with all of that information. Before, though, we get to that, other information that we know about him. So I'm going again, before Revolution, how he's described as just a person. Britannica describes him as being short and small framed. So samesies. You can relate there. Erin, I'm sure you'll pick up on this right away. Other descriptions from Britannica reminds me of another revolutionary who I'll someday cover on the podcast. And is one of my, I don't want to say favorite historical.
Don't say favorite.
Most fascinates me. He was known for not being, it's kind of such a strange thing to think of us in this culture now of abundance, but not being consumed by food or drink, putting his time and energy into work.
Austere, very Robespierre.
Oh, there we go. Yep. He slept supposedly an average of 3 to 4 hours, and he was just described as always being on the move, which also makes me think of Nonstop from Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, of course.
Oh, it all goes back to Hamilton.
I also only sleep 3 to 4 hours, but not on purpose, not to be productive, just because I have insomnia.
The historian of the biography on Toussaint called Black Spartacus. I'm going to try to pronounce his name. Again, I'm not trying to be a elitist white person. It's just, there's a lot of names. Sadir Harazing. He, again, wrote in 2021 a biography on Toussaint called Black Spartacus. I'm going to send you a picture from the cover because I think the cover is really interesting, and it's by a Black Haitian artist in a little bit here. But I watched an lecture online that he gave about Toussaint and the Revolution, and I read some parts from the book. I didn't read the whole book. He mentions that there was just some magic about Toussaint. Particularly later, he was known for owning white horses, and he would basically trot around on these white horses. He was flamboyant, definitely charismatic. He had like a prodigal memory. Actually, I'll send you now the cover of his book. There's a more famous portrait of him, but I really do like this one that comes from Black Spartacus.
And this one's one that was created for the book. Oh, wow.
The book, yeah. It's painted by a Haitian artist, which I like.
Yeah. It's giving Napoleon. It's really evocative. And just thinking about, there had to have been something about him that would make people follow him. I know we haven't gotten to the revolutionary aspect of him yet, but there had to have been some charisma. And I think looking at a picture like this, I know this isn't from the time, but you can look at pictures that are from that time period. I don't know if they're after he died or during his lifetime, but
yeah, mostly after. I'm going to put on Instagram, there's probably the most famous portrait of him. I don't know if I have to look back at Erin at the Instagram story that you use, but there's quite a few. And then there's also some more modern ones from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I have some kind of more modern takes on him. I think all of them are definitely worth looking at. I think it's definitely a pretty powerful image because it shows him. I don't know. I think there's just something that like je ne sais quoi, if we're talking French, about him in that picture.
Very French. The background, I can't tell. It looks almost like in medieval art. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know. Matt, you might. I'm not an art historian.
Oh, I thought you were about to imply that I should remember medieval
No.
art. I'm like, boy, I'm a little older than you, but I don't remember medieval art.
Back then when you were around, the halo, where you get in religious art of the times, I think is what it's evoking. At least that's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
Or if listeners have it up, I think you could also ask, is the sun rising on a free Haiti, or is it going down on a free Haiti?
It probably means multiple things.
I like all of your interpretations.
Well, this is what I was thinking of. I'm sending you what you usually see in religious art that circled the halo, which I sent you.
Yeah. I think, Erin, as you were talking about with, as we said, Spartacus and comparisons to earlier leaders in history, even if it's not religious connections. So as Matt was talking about earlier, he mentioned briefly, Toussaint was freed in 1776.
How old would that put him around?
So about 30, 33, around the age 33. And he did get married. I've seen 2 different names. I've seen Suzanne, Simone Baptiste. Others mention a wife named Celine. So again, the name of who he was married to uncertain, but he did get married, and accounts say he had 2 children. And then again, it seems like the next 15 years of his life, there's very little what we know about him, although there is a big piece we know about him that's going to bring into the complexity here in a second. So here's where some of his legacy gets complicated. So when he's freed, he and his wife don't move far. In fact, he leases a coffee plantation in the same area, like basically right next to his former plantation master's land. And he continues to oversee his former plantation master's land. And if you haven't guessed it yet, he's not the one most likely doing the physical work on his land. So, yes,
he's taking advantage of the slave system.
Yes. So most likely, and I do want to put an asterisk here because there have been some historians who push back on that because, as we said, there's not a ton of records, but most likely there's, I'd say, more reason to believe yes than not he enslaved people himself. And because of that, made a decent amount of money thanks to the slave exploitation. As I said, historical records are not unanimous about whether he owned enslaved people. Some pre-revolutionary accounts suggest he did have a small number of enslaved people on his plantation. Others dispute this. But I would say instead of disputing this, debating it, kind of going into that, let's just note that he was definitely an anomaly among his peers, right? We know he was literate, other kind of things about him. He was able to read people well. He was able to read the social hierarchy very well. And he was very much able to maneuver within a system that both rewarded him. In this case, he was freed, so he rises up in the hierarchy, but also constrained him, right? There's only so far he can go.
Yeah, there's still a glass ceiling there. So it sounds like he's doing well as he could be.
Yes.
But yeah, he's not living in abject poverty if he has a plantation.
Land that he's leasing, yeah. He had some mobility within this hierarchy, and his experiences gave him a keen understanding about the social structures and the economics of Saint-Domingue. So, as historian Laurent Dubois writes in Avengers of the New World, quote, Louverture's early years gave him a deep understanding of both the brutality of slavery and the mechanics of plantation economics, end quote. And that's going to be very important when he becomes leader later on, because I don't want to say he's seen both sides, but kind of. He has seen and we'll see some sympathies towards the white settlers, and he has obviously sympathies and has seen from the enslaved perspective. And as a person, you can see that and not necessarily be like bright about it and be able to make these very skilled maneuvers, but he's very in tune to it. And
he's watching, he's learning, he's taking it all in. Nothing's escaping him, it sounds like.
Yeah, let's just say this is my one quote here that I have that perhaps, again, in a heavy topic might bring some lightness. So let's just say he has a particular set of skills, not so unlike Liam Neeson in Taken. So to take him from enslaved person to later a political and military leader. Definitely, when I say very particular, because he's not what we would say, quote unquote, like the norm of his other peers. He has a different experience as he grows up. Okay, now we're going to France. Okay, so let's go bigger picture.
There's nothing going on in France at this time. What do you talk about?
Yeah, I know. Because context matters here with France. And as I said, I'm going to try to keep it, and especially for me as somebody who loves the French Revolution, it's hard for me to keep it in check, but I'm going to try to keep it as
short as possible. We will be talking about it. We will be going back to it at some point for a full episode.
Yes, I promise. Remember, France is the colonizer of Saint-Domingue. So if you're familiar with chronology of history or you have some idea, you might be thinking, hey, we're approaching a very significant time in French history.
Sorry, Louis the 16th. Sorry, Marie Antoinette.
I mean, I just mentioned 1776 as the year that he's freed, which, might bring up some American history ideas as well for making connections. But France itself is going to be splintered by revolution and war in the late 1780s. As I said, I'm going to try really hard not to go into the specifics. But the French Revolution, which started in 1789, the biggest thing I want to take away, it wasn't just about an out-of-touch king and queen. A lot of times, again, sometimes boil down to that. Like, yeah, Louis the 16th, Marie Antoinette, and we get brought up with that in the guillotine, especially as we're talking about Haiti, or what will become Haiti, Saint-Domingue. There's this radical rethinking of rights, citizenship, sovereignty. Matt, why does this sound so oddly familiar?
I'm completely lost. I don't know what these what these connections are. You'll have to give
What
me
is
more.
it? Liberté.
Equality.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
We've got our liberty. We've got our brotherhood. We've got our equality. All in the mix. It's a hotbed of, France sees what's going on in America and says, "Ooh, we want that, but how about bloodier?"
Maybe some heads on stakes, maybe?
Yeah, we could do better. We could do better.
That's what I say if we're comparing it to the French Revolution. If we want to say, quote unquote, starts, we can say the spark, right, in the French Revolution with the Bastille.
The Bastille. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and, heads on stake there. I would say the spark here is even less of a spark and an explosion. It's going to happen in 1791. If we're talking about comparisons, we're 2 years into the French Revolution. Knowledge is coming, obviously, from France and trickling into Saint-Domingue.
Basically, the French, the minority, the people who own the plantations, they're all French. They're all watching this. I know he's going to come up. Emperor Napoleon. Yes. His wife, Empress Josephine, she was born, or at least spent some of her childhood in Martinique, which is not that far from Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
I think people think that back then that things are closed off. They're like, oh, there's an ocean between them, but there's a lot, they know how to do letters. You're not closed off from what's going on in France just because you're in Haiti or Hispaniola.
Exactly, for sure. We're 2 years in. People are talking, and as you're talking about, which I'll talk about in a minute, when you're talking about internal and external conflicts with France, like, it's very messy. In 1791, there's going to be a slave revolt in the northern province of Saint-Domingue. So let's get into it. I already talked about the enslaved population numbers. We're nearly at 500,000 white colonists, 30,000. And there is a third group, as I mentioned, kind of really briefly, because Toussaint's in that third group at this time. There's free people of color. Some who are more wealthy than others, some who are more educated than others, but they're still denied basic rights. They don't have political power. They don't have citizenship. Again, they're still kind of trapped within this hierarchy. And tensions are boiling, right? The French Revolution's raging in Europe, and ideas, just like we were talking about, liberty, equality, brotherhood, floating across the Atlantic. And here in Saint-Domingue, those ideas are dangerous because in France, they're saying, wait. No, this only applies to white French people. They threaten the entire colonial system. So it's a Pandora's box. And once those ideas are out there, you can't put them back in.
No take-backsies.
No. The event that people talk about, most say it was on August 21st, but for sure sometime in August in 1791. In Bois Camon, which is an area in northern Saint-Domingue. I've seen this former slave turned spiritual leader's name written in 2 different ways, and it's probably because, again, there's not a lot of documentation. Sometimes it's Boukman Duty, and sometimes it's Duty Boukman. He was leading a secret meeting of enslaved men and women, and he delivers this stirring call to arms in Haitian Creole. So one of the quotes that kind of supposedly came from him is, quote, "The God of the white man calls him to commit crimes. Our God asks only good works of us. But this God who is so good orders revenge. He will direct our hands. He will aid us," end quote. Mhm.
Good speech.
Good speech. Yep. And we do know, if we're looking forward, my brain is more in that U.S. history as Matt is. We know that there's that fear of meetings of enslaved peoples because of potential things like this, where get together.
This is the fear. This is the great fear.
Right. They get together and things might happen. This basically kicks off what we'll call as a revolt because, right, we're not quite in the revolution yet. That will turn into a revolution. But within weeks, what we do know that happens, more than 1,500 plantations, so sugar and coffee, are in flames.
Wow.
Nearly 80,000 enslaved people have risen up. As I said, we can call it less of a spark and more of an explosion. Slave owners are taken from their beds, grabbed, stabbed. Families are massacred.
Mm-hmm.
People's heads are on spikes, just like in France. It's years of oppression now being let out.
The reign of terror 2.0, but the terror is not on the, well, I guess it is on the aristocrats. I was going to say not on the aristocrats,
yeah.
but that's who own these places.
Yes. That's where you grapple with where it's like, oh, you hear about families and kids getting attacked and killed, but at the same time, as we've talked about earlier, there's a lot of reason for this intense explosion of
I agree. That's we talked about the brutality of the Caribbean slave system in particular. That would do something to you if you've been around this brutality and this bloodshed. These people, you're desensitized to it.
Yeah. I mean, and again, especially when you have the numbers, and while things aren't always a numbers game, like in this case, it's when you have a large group who are willing to revolt. But crucially, Toussaint doesn't pick up arms here. In fact, he first does something you probably wouldn't suspect, although I kind of hinted at it earlier. He goes and actually protects his former plantation owner. He keeps him from being harmed there. So
I don't know if he deserved it, but you're a good guy. You're a better man than me, Toussaint.
Now, Toussaint's secretary will later write that, quote, he did not forget those who had treated him with dignity, even in a world built on indignity, end quote. We can interpret this in a bunch of different ways. While Toussaint is going to write a memoir, we don't know exactly what he was thinking. Most note that this act wasn't just personal, that it was also strategic, that he understood the importance of maintaining order even in a revolution, because we're going to see that later. Mm-hmm. It also showed his capacity for forgiveness, or at least political calculation. So he sat out largely this initial uprising, securing safety for his family, not taking part in that initial violence, really waiting to see how the tides are going to turn, which makes sense because he's worried about white reprisals if this burns out quick, that it's going to be not good for him.
Well, especially, I mean, not to say that everybody's selfish, but he's got a good thing going. He's not the poorest of the poor.
Yes.
I'm sure he is having that calculus and saying, I have a family, and if this burns out very quickly, then all that hard work, all those decisions I made leading up to this, it's over.
Right. He's about 50 at this time, so it makes sense for where he was in the hierarchy. It's not like, okay, yeah, let me go straight into this conflict, because as he had seen throughout his life, that pushback is going to be very brutal if it's not successful.
It's a difficult decision to make. I don't know how anybody makes that decision, but at this point, obviously, it's not enough to lure him into action.
Right. And of course, the white planters in Saint-Domingue are in panic, and they're reaching out to France, which is still in turmoil. The revolution has definitely not ended. And what they're most concerned with, of course, is security, property, and a future that kept that plantation system intact. And so France is scrambling to respond. At this point, the National Assembly is the government of the country at the time. Again, I'm not going to go too much into all those different stages of the revolution.
No king. King's gone.
As you just mentioned, the king's gone. France has beheaded King Louis XVI. There's declaration of war on England. Spain declares war on France and England. So I don't want to go too much into all of that, but it makes sense, right? Rival powers, especially Spain with a colony just
Right there.
literally on the island. They see this chaos in France and they're like, great, this is our opportunity to shrink French influence and maybe take some of their colonies. Like, that's the time to do it.
Mhm.
When France is already fighting an internal revolution and then obviously external wars, France has its hands full. So in a pattern that definitely won't ever be repeated in history, when a colonizer or country is in power is busy, it might also be the best opportunity for a colony to, you know, as Aham would say, rise up.
Rise up. Rise up.
Other people getting involved. So suddenly, Saint-Domingue becomes ground zero for imperial warfare because I'm going to start with France and Spain because Britain doesn't come until later. They're all vying for control of this colony. You can just kind of see the dollar signs in their eyes, right? This is the perfect time.
Yeah. It's all muddy. Spain wants more.
Toussaint now comes into the picture as he decides to join the rebel forces, but not under the French flag. So while he sat out largely that initial uprising, as I had noted earlier, especially because he was free himself, he saw opportunity in that slave rebellion as it continued and seemed to lead into a revolution. He decides to join the fight for liberation. I do want to make an important note, though, because I keep mentioning these European Enlightenment ideals. They were not the only part that brought enslaved people to rise up. Also, ideas came from Africa, because as I said, many of the enslaved people were coming straight from Africa, where they had been in other places of power, had other identities. So it wasn't just like, ooh, we just love these European ideals of, you know, equality and liberty. It's this mix of European and African ideas that made the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue rise up. By 1793, his alliance with Spain, which is what we're talking about, this little island, they're controlling the other half. He's fighting with them, and Spain sees this uprising as a chance to take over the entire colony. And keep in mind, he's 50 at the time, so he's not a young buck.
No. He's lucky. He's lucky that he's made it this far.
This is kind of where his name actually comes into what we would say is like history.
Matt, there's still a chance.
Toussaint offered military support, and in return, he fought against French forces. So kind of like a, what's the term? They're almost like a paid extra army.
Oh, mercenary?
There you go. Kind of
mercenary?
like that. Yeah. So they, in turn, they're like, hey, we see that you're fighting against France. We also don't like France. Here's some military support. They're fighting against French forces. And it's not because, of course, Spain was like, yay, Black Republic.
Not Spain. It's not that. Spain, I mean, they kicked out the Moors, but yeah, not that the Moors are, you know, enslaved or anything. But historically, they have their own problems with slavery and servitude.
Yeah. Yeah. But the more unstable they can make France, the better chance they can take over the colony. And, right, this is never a move we'll ever see again in history, right? Offering military support to continue making things unstable.
That's what France did, helping the American Revolution, because they hated the Brits. It all happens. It's full circle.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a very simple construct. My enemy's enemy is my friend. And you see this happen a lot. Spain actively encourages slave rebellions when it controls Florida, you know, early on in the American experiment. And there's also these really, I mean, they're almost, looking back on it now, I guess, they almost make you want to grin, these kinds of like dark ironies. Like there's a lot of primary source evidence that there was always a tension going back to the 1680s between some progressive elements of the Catholic Church in Haiti who wanted, very high-handedly, of course, and, you know, very crassly, to wipe out all West African religious identity in the enslaved population. But by the same token, to do that, you have to take time out of the week for sacramental worship and religious instruction. And even if you try and carefully parse that so that no one walks away literate, it's going to be time away from coffee and sugar and indigo production. So ultimately, because that plantation system wanted to maintain its profitability, those West African, like Obeah, religious systems stayed alive. They survived, and they reconfigured themselves. And eventually they reached a kind of a threshold where they felt that the identity that I have as an African in the quote unquote New World doesn't mean that the spirits aren't still there. My ancestors aren't still there. It's time for us to resist. And then that, of course, puts Louverture in this odd position of like, well, he's actually he's in a different spot in the ecosystem because he does have greater familiarity with the Catholic tradition and some of the, not just the Enlightenment ideology, but he also apparently, as I know you're about to tell us, has read some engineering and some military strategy and some international finance tracks.
A lot.
I mean, he's got a very sophisticated toolkit that he's going to use. And that's where his defenders, by the way, will usually say, okay, to the extent that he may have participated in owning slaves himself, it was primarily when he reaches this stage where he's a resistance leader, because he famously says anyone on this island who wants to remain here has to show that they're useful. And that means that we have to keep the ports running and we have to keep soldiers in the field, and you may be paid poorly or not at all, but it's not because I'm a slaveholder.
Greater cause.
Right. And that's probably why, because I know when I first heard that we were going to do him on the podcast, I was like, well, how are you going to come down against him? But then, when you look at some of the mechanisms that he deploys to try and win freedom for his people, I don't know, maybe the means will rub some people the wrong way.
Let's say revolutions are tricky. They're ugly. Like in a lot of ways it requires sometimes the means justify the end, but it's hard to say, especially going in. These ones, they're not bloodless. This is not.
No.
These are not bloodless revolutions. I do think basically you could put any revolutionary up against our rubric, and just because they inhabit these weird areas where they have these great ideals, these things that we praise them for. But in order to act that out, you have to do some things that maybe they wouldn't necessarily have done if they weren't in this revolution.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest adjective that we could use towards him to describe him is pragmatic. Like at the end of the day, he's going to be very pragmatic when it comes push comes to shove. Like if the economics of Saint-Domingue are not running, then we don't have anything. So he's going to be willing to, I think, compromise on some things that some people would be like, I don't know how I feel about that, but it's about the
choice. That's a hard choice.
It's the ability to basically take a colony in chaos and try to have it be as stable as possible, as quick as possible. As we said, he's self-taught, but Toussaint, is definitely a self-taught military strategist, and he's really a quite brilliant one. It also helps that his troops are very loyal to him. That just kind of that je ne sais quoi about him. He demands loyalty, and we'll see from a whole bunch of people. It's not later going to be just his troops. And he's really able to calculate the weaknesses and the strengths in both his troops along with his enemies. They use a combination of guerrilla warfare, which obviously helps that they have knowledge of the land, ambush attacks to overtake the more conventionally trained French troops. So by mid-1793, Cap Francais, which is one of the wealthiest colonial cities, is in ruins. White colonists have fled in huge numbers, and now the British are by October planning to invade Saint-Domingue. So the French see the writing on the wall. They're like, we can't be fighting the Spanish, the British, and the enslaved people. So they make what I think has changed historically in context how they've made this decision, but they made a very calculated and radical move. Anyone want to take a guess of what they do?
Do they just bail?
Nope.
I'm assuming no. Okay. I don't know. Matt, you want to guess, or do you know?
No, I'll wait.
I'll give you a clue. I would say this. It's not a direct comparison, but I would say similar to what the North does with the Southern states during the Civil War.
Oh, do they just like raise it? Or they just like burn everything so it's not profitable?
There is going to be that, yes, but also something that Lincoln famously does that doesn't affect border states because he doesn't want to lose them.
Oh, free slaves. They free the slaves.
In the places where there is no power to directly do so.
Make a very calculated, is radical.
Yeah, they're definitely not out of the goodness of their hearts. And not like,
right.
Well, after we've been pondering our revolutionary ideas, we've come to decide that our brethren in chains are now equal to us. No.
That's what I think has changed, because at least in a few of the readings and lectures that I've seen, a lot of it nowadays has kind of become more of like because of the Enlightenment, we've seen this as opposed to this is a military strategy where, hey, we're going to free the enslaved people under their authority, especially in Saint-Domingue, and they're hoping to then shore up, basically taking people like Toussaint and using them as military support against the foreign invaders. This is going to have them switch sides, which it does. So if France gets to that point in the revolution where
they've had enough time to think,
right, as opposed to like, we can't be fighting all these people at once. At least get the enslaved people who are again being basically bought out by the Spanish. So let's get them on our side. So if we promise them freedom,
and then it's like it's ownership. They have ownership of the island, and then they're like, it's us against the foreign invaders.
Exactly. Yeah.
Us versus them. It's a powerful tool.
It is. And so this is when Toussaint's military genius soon steals the spotlight, and we have a team swap. So late 1793, Toussaint rallies his men. Quote, "Brothers and friends, I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue." So he's going to bring this. This is not what he says, obviously. He's going to bring this to the other side of the island as well. "Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause." He's hoping by siding with the French, that means all the rights, all the liberty, equality, brotherhood is coming to both Saint-Domingue and Santo Domingo, so the whole island. And that's kind of where he really, I would say, stakes his claim. I would say his number one priority is always, after this moment, to keep slavery gone from the French Republic, because that's not always a guarantee, as we'll see coming up. So he really puts his foot down and is like, this needs to happen across the entire empire if we're going to continue to fight. And so in February 1794, across the entire empire, slavery is abolished. And Toussaint teams up with French General Etienne Laveau, who makes him a lieutenant general. Of course, if you're looking on the negative piece, it's a little bit of backstabbing, right? He's turning tides. He's going the other way. It makes sense for him and his men to, right. I don't want to say just like, it's not just going with the winds of change. It's like, okay, this is what we want. This is where we can really see future for the land. And this is tide turning for the French. So victory follows victory. Toussaint uses the same guerrilla warfare, and he uses knowledge of the land. All that knowledge that he had as a young man as they said, he just had this prodigal memory. He just would read all these books on military strategy, and there's no other way to say that he just had this really extremely, incredibly skilled mind at being able to see.
Well, just to take that in and then be able to synthesize.
How did the best win? Because that's where his name comes from. And so there's questions of where L'Ouverture comes from, but what it does mean is an opening. And so some people say Laveau baptizes him with it, which is the French general. Other people say he or his men, but it's that idea that he could find an opening anywhere he goes. He's so talented that even in spots where it's like, that seems impossible, he can find a way to win.
Yeah, he's just like the man that eventually he'll go up against Napoleon, I think. Doesn't he go up against Napoleon? Or okay. Just like that. And it's like, just when you think you could count him out, he's back. He's back, baby.
100%. Yeah. And it's, as we said, his military strategy, and then we'll see here in a second, his kind of political prowess and his ability to really appeal to a broad piece of the people of Saint-Domingue is really going to make him, I don't want to say just an anomaly, but yeah, I mean, somebody who's a clear leader.
Well, not unlike our Napoleon.
The Spanish kind of head out, basically. That's going to make him a clear leader for Saint-Domingue. So they drive off the Spanish and British forces. And just to be clear, they haven't beaten France, right? They are working with France. I think sometimes there's that misconception. Like, they are on France's side to help beat against the external forces. And so by 1797, Toussaint is really the de facto ruler of Saint-Domingue. I think the big question is, like, how did he get here? Outmaneuvered not just the foreign invaders, but also rival rebel leaders, who could have taken his place. And you can really see how he's given his last name. Like I said here, he's really able to do what very few people in power could do. So according to Britannica, quote, by 1795, Toussaint Louverture was widely known and admired by all racial groups, end quote. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when it comes to the Constitution, but it's not like he is only applauded by the Black population. Actually, the white settlers find him.
Like, actually, he's fine. He's okay. We like him.
Like, they are okay because of what he wants to put in place. So his military victories and his diplomatic skills, he's both a learned politician and a military strategist, and he's earned the trust of French commissioners. And so they appoint him like commander-in-chief of the colony's forces. And this is where he kind of does some, again, major political maneuvering. So I was talking about, again, the author of Black Spartacus in his lecture. I really like how he talks about this, how Toussaint would, quote, befriend, bully, and basically shoo each French administrator after one another who would come in after that. Like, okay, I'm coming in. I'm going to be taking power. I'm going to be ruling Saint-Domingue. And Toussaint would either shoo him away, bully, do whatever he could. The last one, in fact, was arrested and held internally for about 2 years before being shipped back off to France.
Damn.
So Toussaint's for sure in charge. As I said, he can maneuver around everything, and the stakes couldn't have been higher because now the colony has been battered by war. The economy's obviously in ruins because, yeah, as you had mentioned, Erin, as a guest, like, there was a lot of scorched earth strategy being used. And social order obviously has been flipped upside down because now you don't have an enslaved population. So what did he do? His leadership was always pragmatic. And here's where you can be a little more judgmental. In this case, it definitely is more on the authoritarian side, but it brought stability to a colony torn by war. He was, of course, loved by the freed formerly enslaved people, but the white settlers appreciated him for bringing back that stability and also not casting them out, because some of the radicals on the island were very much about no white settlers on the island, and he was about kind of creating this new land that did have even these white settlers. Compared to other leaders that could potentially have taken power, he was definitely more palatable. Instead of letting things spiral into chaos, Toussaint made some bold choices. For one, he ignored the French's insistence to leave Saint-Domingue alone. Again, Saint-Domingue is controlled by the Spanish. They're like, don't
poke the bear.
We have enough on our plates. Instead, he took his troops, he overran it, he freed the slaves, and he's like, now we have this whole island. And that's going to lead to the Constitution of 1801. They draft a constitution that's going to make Saint-Domingue, so the entire island now, even though I'm saying just Saint-Domingue, but they've conquered Santo Domingo, which is controlled by Spanish, a self-governing colony of France. With him, Toussaint, as Governor General, that's going to be his title, and that will be his title and his role for life. There's no term limits in that case. But before we talk about that piece, self-governing colony of France. So for those who are trying to figure out, well, what does that mean that's different than independence? Any comparisons we can make?
Isn't that what America was before independence?
Right. Well, and I think you can make an argument that after the American Revolution, Britain tries to learn from its mistake, and it slowly evolves this idea of the Commonwealth.
We're not going to do that anymore. Yeah, the Commonwealth's still a thing, though.
Right.
Yep.
So, in some ways, I suppose it kind of foreshadows that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's kind of just a really important thing I wanted to note, is that it's not at this point to the point of where now we're suddenly Haiti, we're completely cut off from the French.
They still want to be involved with France, just on their own terms in a way, you could say.
Yeah, right. And then here's where we have that complexity of a title, Governor General.
For life, very Caesar. Very Julius
For life,
Caesar.
where we get a little, okay, we'll see how that goes.
Julius Caesar.
We are starting to wrap up, but I do want to talk a little bit here about the Constitution before we wrap up part one. From the Constitution, quote, and this is very much in line with what I had talked about with Toussaint's major priorities, quote, there cannot exist slaves in this territory. Servitude is therein forever abolished. All men are born, live, and die free and French, end quote. You see it right there. Again, not Haitian, not independent. They live and die French, but free. That line etched into the Constitution, it's more than just legal language. It's a huge declaration at that time period, right? And it's also, as you guys already mentioned, with Britain being like, oh, maybe we should take some lessons. It's a challenge kind of to the world. He's rewriting the rules of empire in his own way when he's governing. And of course, he's saying, like, we're free, we're French, we're not going back. And he's going to stick to his whole life, willing to give up a lot, which we'll talk about in part two, for the promise to never return to slavery. That is his number one. But as we know, freedom on paper doesn't always mean peace on the ground. The Constitution asserted autonomy, yes, but it also kept Toussaint in power for life, which, when you're talking about Enlightenment ideals,
we're not talking democracy here. It's authoritarian. Perhaps Toussaint might be a better authoritarian than, say, Julius Caesar or actual Napoleon, but still tricky.
And it's tricky because he was very well liked by, again, the people of the island.
If he had gone through the elections, if there were terms, he probably would have won anyway.
Right. And yeah, there's things that support all these different groups of people that the hope is to bring that stability, that it's not going to crumble right away. Because, yes, he wanted autonomy, but he also, with the Constitution, protected property rights. So they kept the plantation system in Saint-Domingue at this time, but they transformed it. So there wasn't slavery, Workers were paid and the land kept producing sugar and coffee, but the profit was shared. There was some profit sharing.
Good profit. I mean, how extensive do we know? Should I give a
still-
little clap, or is it very muted? Should it be like a full-fledged clap or a golf clap?
It depends on kind of where you stand, right? For the white colonists, this made him, and to the Europeans, it made him beyond palatable because it allowed white colonists to return. Like, it wasn't freedom in the modern sense, but in Toussaint's eyes, it was stability because it was a system that he thought would protect the island's economy and prevent foreign powers from swooping back in and picking up where France or any of those other countries, again, who wanted to take over, that fear of slavery being reintroduced. So when we say profit was shared, the workers are still not, I would say, anywhere near on the hierarchy, like at the top, but they aren't also enslaved.
Sort of like sharecropping in a way?
From what I read, it seemed like it was
or indentured servitude, sort of.
A little less than that. Obviously, it's so hard because there were so many still tensions because, again, a lot of them are working on the same lands that they had been enslaved to, but they were making money. And the big piece is, like, as we're going to see, I don't want to say that it doesn't last a while, but it doesn't last a while because somebody's going to come in. So it's almost like it would be interesting to see what would have happened
if it would have evolved.
If it had more time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the big piece is that workers were paid, and that was his biggest sticking point. There is no slavery. And so it makes it hard because, as I said, it's not exactly freedom, as you already mentioned, sharecropping and things like that. It's not what we would think of like a complete rewriting of how the colony is going to work. But in Toussaint's eyes, it was stability. And that's his biggest piece, is stability of the colony. He also makes promises to Britain to not invade Jamaica or the American South, as trade with Britain and the U.S. was, again, key to the economy. He was very diplomatic to weave around his enemies, even if it came at real costs. The British actually offered to give him the title of king for that. And he actually refused. He supposedly didn't like pompous titles, although I guess governor generals.
Hey, this is very Caesar. I'm going to turn away that crown, but I will be your leader for the rest of my life.
And, British still had slavery, so he wasn't a big fan of the British, but he's also not completely letting himself being walked over. Again, very pragmatic of like, no, we're not trying to build an empire. We're not trying to do this and that. The British, again, wanting to undermine the French, like, hey, we'll call you, we'll give you a title. We'll do that. And he's like, no, I still have that loyalty to France. There's some kind of interesting dynamics at play, but he also pushed for education. So literacy programs popped up for both the formerly enslaved and the free. These are in the early days. It wasn't revolutionary schooling. This is just a start, but especially in a society built on denying knowledge to the enslaved people as a way to keep that social hierarchy in place, like this is a big move. And he's noted for easing racial tensions on the island by preaching that the Black population should learn from the Europeans and their ways. Yeah. So, for example, he was very Catholic. So also in the Constitution is that Catholicism is the religion of the state. There's definitely some pieces there where he is saying, like, let's learn from the Europeans and their, sophisticated ways.
I wonder how much is like, I'm sure some of it is internalized stuff that he believes, but also part of it, I wonder, is if it's like, again, to make it himself palatable, make himself appeal to, the cross population of the island and abroad.
I think it's definitely both. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that my guess would be it's both. It's because if he goes too far, because some saw his vision of Saint-Domingue as a betrayal of the revolution's ideals. Like if he went as far to say, we're independent, we're changing the entire economic system and all of this, like France is going to swoop right back in and
yeah, they'd have no qualms to be like, okay, never mind. Let's end this experiment.
Right. Unfortunately, France is going to swoop back in.
But not because of that.
Not because of that, yeah. But his willingness was to compromise as long as slavery was outlawed. So some wanted the Europeans expelled from the island. Others saw it as genius, his move. Like it was a way to preserve abolition and avoid total collapse. As historian Laurent Dubois puts it, quote, Louverture's constitution was both a declaration of autonomy and a bid for legitimacy in a world that feared Black sovereignty, end quote. And as for Toussaint, British observer Marcus Rainsford noted, quote, Toussaint governed with firmness, but his ambition alarmed even his enemies, end quote. So you see a little bit of, a bit of both pragmatic moves that perhaps were the only thing that would work at the moment, and then also some fears of his ambition and authoritarianism.
Well, you wonder, it's like if there's only so long they're going to let this ex-slave rule an island. At some point, they're going to be like, it was fine. We wanted everything stable, but now we want to come back in and let's erase what happened and go back to how it was.
Yeah. And that's a perfect place to end it, Erin, because Toussaint in the Constitution.
Am I foreseeing something? I don't know how the rest of his story plays out. So
yep, you are foreseeing it correctly. So the Constitution of 1801 was not celebrated by France. As I already had said, he defied French orders when he conquered Saint-Domingue, and he declared the slaves free there and under his control in 1799. Like, he's definitely acting on his own in his decision-making. He's not deferring to the French, even though in writing, they're still part of the French Empire. And especially when France's leader comes into the picture, another man who Toussaint is sometimes compared to,
Napoleon Bonaparte.
There you go. And despite wanting to show, actually, Toussaint wanted to show his loyalty to Napoleon Bonaparte. Also, hashtag authoritarian Toussaint.
Just as you have a thing for Robespierre, Napoleon's my weird little Corsican authoritarian crush.
Yeah. Toussaint was not doing that by showing loyalty. And Napoleon, while he had at first kind of confirmed Louverture's position, been not fighting back, but even Toussaint knew that Napoleon was worried about France losing that precious colony because money. If the system, right, is changing the economy, even if it's not restructuring it, they're not making as much money as they wanted. And there was knowledge that Napoleon wanted to restore white control over the colony. Toussaint's declaration of Saint-Domingue's autonomy was a direct challenge to the French authority. He was a Black general ruling a colony with his own law. That was too much.
That was never going to be long-term, at least not for France. They'll let them ride it out while they have issues. But as soon as somebody like Napoleon comes in and stabilizes France stabilizes France. France is still warring with, obviously, famously, Britain and other powers, but the internal politics have stabilized enough that they can turn their eye back to Haiti.
The empire. Yep. So it's like, okay, you helped us win. You helped us push out the Spanish and the British. And now we have enough stability. And
you see this time and time again. Sorry. This is this is Roman Empire all over again.
All right.
We'll allow you to be a fake emperor in your spot while we deal with these Goths. But as soon as the Goths are dealt with, we're coming for you.
And that's 100% what's going to happen in part 2. It looks like things are looking positive, I would say, for the most part for Saint-Domingue, except for, as we said, things are coming that are going to shift the tides.
Woo-hoo.
Exciting. We have a cliffhanger.
Yeah, part 2 should be shorter, but we'll see again, as you both had said, as Napoleon enters the picture. He's not going to let Toussaint keep that power, and that, especially as a Black leader, race comes into the picture, and just his own desire to be in control of the French Empire. He is certainly not going to let somebody as skillful with politics and military and things like that stand against him.
I see you, I am you.
Right. Yeah. Some people call Toussaint the Black Napoleon. Yeah. I'm not going to deal with that. So we're going to take some swift moves to get you out of power, maybe in some not so great ways. I will end it there. French speakers, I hope I didn't offend your ears too much.
It sounded fine.
Okay. On Instagram, I'll post some of those portraits. So kind of the more famous traditional portraits of Toussaint, as well as the ones, as I had mentioned, that I had sent to Erin and Matt for Black Spartacus. I really like that cover of the book. I think it shows him in a appropriate light as a leader.
Yeah, it's a beautiful cover.
It is, yeah. And the idea that it's painted by a Haitian artist, I really like that continued kind of celebration about his legacy in Haiti, how he's seen today as well. Any other last words from you two?
No.
I should say that there will be, in part 2, a number of moments where listeners will look to the United States to maybe participate in this revolutionary experience and ally itself with the journey of freedom. And
no,
we're not really going to be on board for that. So that's going to factor into the evaluation.
Yeah, not so much.
Sorry.
Yep. Sorry, US. Yep.
Although, if you are a John Adams fan, he will come out of this with flying colors. But Thomas Jefferson,
never has he ever. At least not. Maybe not in the past. 20, 30 years. Do we come around to the legacy of TJ?
In the 1980s and 1990s, it was totally flipped.
I
Jefferson
know.
was the rock star, and Hamilton was seen as cold and calculating and focused too much on markets and finance, and infrastructure, and the poetry of America was supposed to be Jefferson, but somebody on Broadway flipped all that around.
Yeah, I'm holding it in. I'm gonna try not to sing. I kind of went into a Hamilton kick this weekend as I was doing research. I was like, hey, little similarities. And
the themes of revolution. It's cross borders, crosses continents, crosses areas, crosses oceans.
Yeah, and from obscurity to, even though, of course, Toussaint's going to be much older than Alexander Hamilton was when he comes into kind of our radar. He's somebody who comes from, very much nothing,
as humble a stock as any to become the leader of a country.
Yeah, and very much from his own mind and kind of willful maneuvering. He's able to rise up and kind of have his name remain in history. Although Toussaint, as I'll talk about in part 2, certainly much lesser known than a lot of revolutionaries, not just in the United States, but also in other countries that will look to Haiti and take lessons and also lead revolutions of their own.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm excited to hear about part 2, because I know, I don't really know what happens to him post-revolution, so this is I know. I know it. Just looking up just the briefest things, I know it doesn't end great, but how it gets to that point, I don't know the narrative. So I'm excited to give him his due. Again, a worthy revolutionary that should be more well known, especially in our part of the world.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we'll be able to, depending on our power couples schedule, we should be able to get part 2 out pretty quickly, because that will be shorter than part 1. as we wrap up kind of his story, because unfortunately, once Napoleon comes into the picture, Toussaint's story is going to be kind of on the downfall.
Yeah, he's at sort of the height of his power, and now comes that slide downwards.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you everybody for listening today, and hopefully you learned some new things and you want to maybe rate or review or join us on Patreon. We'd love to see you in any of those places, especially Patreon. If you have some strong feelings about who we should cover next, that's definitely going to be a big part that will be coming up very shortly with a poll. So we'll see if I'll continue to go on a different route than my usual, or maybe again, if you want to see some other figures such as Toussaint that are a little less conventional for me, or done, or pre-pants.
Pre-pants. Welcome to the world of pre-pants.
No, I'm still in post-pants.
I guess,
I'm still in post-pants.
Well,
I'm still in post-pants.
Well, kind of. This is breeches. So
that's true. Right. We're right around the edge. Okay. Like capris.
Come on.
There you go.
Come on,
man.
back. Come on back, Jamie. Come to the medieval times. I'll give you a medieval king.
I know.
I'll put one on the list for you.
I know. I think you're hinting at one that might be your next figure.
He's pre-medieval. Anglo-Saxon, perhaps.
Something maybe also when we're talking about media and kind of free interest might also be coming into the picture. So our little hint there on the Erin side, at least that was my vote for Erin's next figure. So thank you again. We're signing off here at Ambivalent Offenders.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.